Welcome into another edition of the 5 Reasons Podcast. My name is Chris Whittingham, joined as always by Ethan Skolnick. We just happen to be in the same area, so we are in person doing this podcast. You can check out all the podcasts in the 5 Reasons Sports Network on Apple Podcasts, Google Play. Some of us are on Spotify, working on getting all of our podcasts on Spotify. Follow us on Twitter at 5 Reasons Sports as we continue to cover the Miami Heat season on Miami Heat Beat. Florida Panthers in full swing over on the Goldie on Ice podcast, swings and misses as Marlins spring training gets going. But right now we actually want to talk some Miami Dolphins because I've been throwing around the tanking idea in my head, Ethan. Frankly, as much as I've been a tanking advocate in other sports, I've not really seen a team. Obviously, Cleveland went and did it, but they didn't really get to see it through because they went 0-16 one season. So there haven't really been teams that have outwardly set to tank. All the reporting, I was on the radio with Omar Kelly yesterday, and he said executives around the league, this is what they're talking about, the Dolphins tanking. And I just kind of want to discuss the practical realities of tanking and how difficult it's going to be. So I kind of want to hit on a variety of different ways that a tank can go about. But in terms of your feelings about tanking in football, how surprised are you that a team is actually, in some respects, going to embark on this strategy?
Well, I think it's mostly surprising because it's so inconsistent with what Steve Ross and the Dolphins have done, right? So if I was to sort of look around the sports landscape at 120-something franchises and say which is one that would actually embrace tanking and say it out loud, the Dolphins would not be top of list on that. I mean, it's just not the way they've operated. They have effectively, efforted to be slightly above mediocre for a very long time. I mean, essentially, when you're committing to Ryan Tannehill as your quarterback for 7 years, you are saying we are not really competing to be great. We're competing to be somewhat relevant if we can put other pieces around him. And so to have a strategy now that is basically, again, from what they've said, and we talked about this when we did the podcast from Dolphins camp after the press conference for introducing Brian Flores, that it wasn't explicitly said during that. But what's gotten out through certain reporters that Steve Ross in particular tends to use to get his message out, or others up high in the organization, is that basically there's going to need to be a ton of patience. Now, here's the only hedge I would put on this. Is that, to a certain degree, it's a buy time tactic. If you don't think you have the pieces internally to be very good right now, then you basically, say we're embarking upon a strategy, and so you get the fans to buy into it, when the reality is you just haven't put a very good team together, and so you probably weren't going to be good next year anyway. I mean, let's say that they were not tanking, right, or whatever it is that they're calling it. I mean, what is the upside of this team next year? If you were to, say, keep Xavien Howard, which is something we're going to talk about, if you were to go out and get a stopgap quarterback like, let's say, Nick Foles, okay, for instance, or maybe Teddy Bridgewater, but Foles, I think, is the best example because he's had some legitimate success. He won a Super Bowl. If you were to do that, so what is the best you could be? 8-8, maybe 9-7 if everything broke right. I mean, 2 years ago you were 10-6. Is it possible? I guess so. Or 3 years ago. So I think this is, to a certain degree, I respect the fact that Steve Ross has reevaluated this and decided we need to go in another direction. To a certain degree, I think it's kind of a cop-out because you're saying, look, we can't get there. We've tried. And now we're going to do something totally different when, again, the reality is if you didn't announce this strategy, it probably would have happened anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other possibility is you bring back Ryan Tannehill and you basically have the same season that you've had for 6 straight seasons. But again, there's no future in that. And I'm kind of impressed in one way that Stephen Ross basically feels what Dolphins fans feel. Because I think if they bring back Tannenbaum and they bring back Gase, they go again with Ryan Tannehill, and they have the same season. We're probably doing this a year from now. So in some respects, Stephen Ross did identify, as much as we talk about owners meddling as being a generally corrosive thing, he's clearly setting the Dolphins on a track that I don't think is necessarily the wrong one. So I do want to give him some credit for that. But let's talk about some of the decisions that they'll have to make or not make in order to pull this off. For me, the first one starts with quarterback. If basically the goal is to get Tua Tagovailoa in 2020 in the draft and have the number 1 overall pick, what do you then do for a year at that position? And is it really as disastrous as bringing in a quarterback like bringing back Luke Falk, or do you draft someone in the mid rounds? Are we basically talking about a non-entity at quarterback, or someone that maybe you're hoping could be an eventual backup for the next guy?
Yeah, well, look, I think the quarterback decision is going to be the one that indicates to us really what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, everything else they do, and the Xavien Howard thing is a close second, but there is a case to be made, and I'm not going to make it because I think if you find an elite cornerback, you keep him and you pay him. But there is a case to be made that even if you were not tanking / rebuilding, that it might make sense to try to create a market for Xavien Howard because, you know, one of the things you and I have talked about the Dolphins, I think the Heat have done this to a certain extent too, is that they have not been particularly good at sort of identifying a player's peak and maximizing the value for that player in the open market or whatever it is that you want to do with a guy.
It's not really something that football teams do, though.
No, but, I don't think that's totally true. I think if you look at what the Steelers and Patriots have done in particular, in a lot of cases, it's just Belichick is looking at the contract a year from now and deciding he doesn't want to pay it, which, again, with Xavien Howard, kind of the same thing. But whether it's a Jamie Collins or,
we got a first-round pick for Richard Seymour.
Seymour, I mean, look at who's the defensive end that went to Arizona, Chandler Jones.
Yeah.
I mean, they've done that over and over. The Steelers, I mean, now they're kind of doing it, not by choice because Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell have basically flipped them off. But previously, Mike Wallace to Miami, Joey Porter to Miami. I mean, a lot of these, Lawrence Timmons to Miami. There seems to be a pattern here. None of it's worked out particularly well, with the exception of one season from Porter. So, look, I think there have been forward-thinking organizations. The Eagles have started to do this, where it's sort of a year early rather than a year late. So teams do it. There is a case to be made for it, but really the decision that is going to be the flashpoint decision. Get beyond the dorks who are doing these podcasts like us, or the ones who are listening to the podcast. We love you all, but the person I run into when I start traveling again, right? So. It's interesting to me because we take certain things for granted because we're in this bubble. So you're doing sports radio. I did sports radio. I was in newspapers for 20 years. We have a chat with people who know basically, the intricacies of the two major salary caps. Okay, like that's the world we're in. But when I travel, when I took 20 Lyft drives in Charlotte for the All-Star game this weekend, the questions that are asked, the conversation that happens is much simpler.
Yes,
it's much simpler. And for people who follow football, it is like I was from Miami. They keep in Tannehill. That's all they know about the Dolphins.
Yeah.
And the reality is, we assume that's just out of town people, right? But it's also the people here that 75 to 85% of people who call themselves Dolphin fans can't name more than 5 players on the team. They're just Dolphin fans. They go to the games,
right.
Okay?
It's the easiest commitment as a sports fan. It's why there are so many, quote, football fans, because it's you sit down on your Sunday at 1 p.m., and then you watch the game, and then you turn it off, and then you remember to watch the game the following Sunday.
Right. It's not like watching 82 Heat games, and of which 15 of them are going to be on the West Coast, and everything else that you're dealing with there. Like it's a different experience, and so I think for those fans, the casuals who are deciding whether to buy tickets to a couple of games or whether to invest, an occasional Sunday with people over the house watching, they just want to know who the quarterback is. So. We have to go through the layers of quarterbacks. I think you'll get an idea how deep the tank is based on which quarterback. So, okay, if they go after, let's start with the veterans. If they're going to go after a Nick Foles or, I think this is unlikely, but a Derek Carr, somebody of that ilk who's had some success in the league, okay? Maybe Bridgewater a little bit lower than that. If they're going after that kind of player, then I think it's fair to say that at the very least they're kind of dipping a toe into the tank. But they're trying to keep some fans around.
Right. They're also open to the possibility that this player that they bring in could surprise them, and they win some games and start building.
Well, let's look at it. I mean, one guy that was mentioned to us on the podcast by a couple people was Ryan Fitzpatrick, right?
Yeah.
And he embodies that because Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to do the same thing. He's done the same thing with every team he's been with. Every team. Buffalo, before he got the contract, the Jets, Tampa, always does this. Hot start. Hot start.
Or at least like a hot 3-game stretch where it's like 1,000 yards and
11 touchdowns.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he does that, and then eventually the picks start to come, and then eventually he's moved to the bench. And so Ryan Fitzpatrick, if you're trying to lose games but appear competitive, Ryan Fitzpatrick is perfect. He's also a Harvard guy. He presents himself well. He's got the beard. He looks like he looks like Slim when Slim grows out the beard.
Had a fun time looking like Conor McGregor at a press conference.
Right. He's perfectly harmless. He's not going to win enough games to actually get you anywhere and screw up your tank.
But again, is he going to win too many games to get the number 1 overall pick?
Well, that's why I say if they're only half committed to the tank, then you bring in a Ryan Fitzpatrick. Okay. If you're not really committed at all,
where does a first-round pick fit in that conversation?
Well, let's get to that in a second. So we got the veteran guys. Okay, now the veteran guys don't preclude you from taking a guy in the first or second round. If you're drafting, and again, I think this is a silly conversation at this point because the same thing just happened. We were talking about Kyler Murray. I don't know who it was with. It might have been you and me, but it might have been somebody else. But Kyler Murray, like a few weeks ago, and it's like, well, I don't know if he should play baseball. Maybe he should play baseball because he's probably not going to be a first-round pick. And I've said repeatedly, quarterbacks always get overdrafted.
Correct.
The hype starts to come, and now we've gone not from he's going to be a second or third-round pick because he's basically, he's a tiny person. Okay, but he may be the first overall pick of the whole draft.
Yeah.
Okay? And so, we're going to start having this conversation, and it feels to me like the Baker Mayfield conversation, which was most people thought around this time a year ago that Baker Mayfield was probably going to go in the 20s. That, again, same thing, not as small as Kyler Murray, but small for the position, okay, not the typical measurables.
And in a system that we feel like it doesn't necessarily produce NFL quarterbacks.
Right, so that was that. And then all of a sudden is, well, can the Dolphins get him at 11, right? Like, that was the thing. And ultimately, I mean, he went first.
Yeah.
And so
people don't remember this. People revisionist history this, but I remember I was really into the 2011 draft, I want to say. And Cam Newton, it was the year that Cam Newton was drafted.
Right.
And people don't remember that Cam Newton was not a consensus top 5 pick. I would read all those mock drafts, and it wasn't until they got to the national championship and won it. But in the middle of that college season, people were like, he's an NFL quarterback?
Right.
And you're right. I think as teams, particularly in the top 10, talk themselves into this. They talk the scouts into this. They talk the draft experts into this. And then all of a sudden, these guys inch further and further forward. To me, the interesting thing is when you look at the prospect rankings, I think only Haskins is in the top 20 on CBS's rankings of overall prospects, right? If you're just saying, a player who's good at his position, that the top guys in this draft aren't really rated that highly. But because they're quarterbacks, they're going to get drafted high. I don't think that of Locke, Murray, and Haskins that are the top 3 guys, I'd be stunned if any of them went to 13. And like you said, if you're really committed to a tank, you're not giving up your 2020 first-round pick to move up in the draft. Correct.
Because, unless one thing. Unless you're committed to a tank, but you're in love with Kyler Murray,
right?
And or Haskins or whoever it is, and if you're in love with a guy,
but you're no longer tanking the moment you take Kyler Murray. Because if you're out your first round pick the next year, then what are you tanking for?
Well,
for the 33rd pick, for the 33rd pick in the second round,
right? You're not tanking, but you're selling It's different. It's not tanking, but it's selling a rebuild around a charismatic, exciting figure. Which, let's be honest here, okay? I mean, let's just cut right to it. I mean, the Dolphins have been the dullest team in the NFL for 20 years. It's not just that they've been sort of non-competitive.
I would say the Bills give them fair competition over 20 years.
The Bills have had some more compelling players than the Dolphins have had, I think. I mean, LaShawn McCoy. I mean, there's been a few at least. The Dolphins have not. I mean, the Dolphins have not had a player that anybody from any of the national shows would come down here to bother to interview since JT and Zach retired. I mean, who's it been? Yeah. I mean,
Brandon Marshall probably
for a year or two, and he was not as good here as he was in other places. I mean, and Brandon Marshall, for all his talk, was an 11-yard catch receiver basically with the Dolphins. Mike Wallace didn't develop into anything. Joey Porter had a couple of years here. One was terrible, one was really good, and spouted his mouth off. But he's not known as a Dolphin. I mean, the most prominent guys that have been through the Dolphins lately, or in the last 20 years, a lot of them are known for their play for other teams. Thurman Thomas, Joey Porter, lots of these guys. Okay, you mentioned Brandon Marshall, Mike Wallace, Carlos Dansby. They're not known as Dolphins. I mean, who have the Dolphins drafted that has become not just a quality player, but a compelling figure? Will Xavien Howard become that? Maybe. He doesn't seem to really have the personality for it. Rashad Jones has been the best player for a while. Nobody outside of Miami knows who the hell Rashad Jones is.
Safety, yeah. I mean, unless you have crazy hair, like there's a limit to how famous you can be as a safety.
Right. I mean, you look at their corners, their linebackers. As we mentioned, they haven't had anybody compelling in forever. Cameron Wake has been a really good player for a long time. I don't think that people outside of Miami really know a whole lot about Cameron Wake. He didn't come up the traditional way. The quarterback's been dull as hell for 7 years. They haven't had a playmaking, game-breaking receiver that actually panned out into something. Their running backs, I mean, Jay Ajayi had half a season basically that he was interesting. So I mean, you have to go back to Ricky. Like is like Jason, Ricky, Zach, and Ricky had a national profile. Mm-hmm. But the only guys, I don't even know that Zach had a national profile. Jason did to a degree,
right.
But really, Ricky and Dan. We're going back 20-plus years, okay? Mm-hmm. And even some of the great players that they've had, during the previous era, a Surtain or a Madison, didn't translate the way that some of the corners do now. They didn't have those kind of Sam did a little bit, but he didn't attract attention nationally. So they've been dull. They've been faceless for so long. And so I can see how it would be compelling to, like, Kyler Murray is a fantastic story. It's not just that he has potential to be a really good quarterback, but I mean he would be a total anomaly at that position. He's Doug. I mean, we can talk about small quarterbacks. Drew Brees is small. Kyler Murray is tiny.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Doug Flutie tiny, right? He's smaller than Doug Flutie was, and yet Heisman and everything else that he's accomplished. I think that there's going to be a real attraction to go for that for the Dolphins. Would that be tanking? No, it would be. We're okay going 3-13 this season because we have somebody whose jersey you're going to buy.
Yeah.
And the Dolphins have just not had that. You go to the stadium. You go to the stadium every week. The jerseys are all the same as they've been for 25 years.
Yeah.
99, 54, and 13.
And frankly, like, why would you invest in another? I mean, right. You might as well have the jersey of a player that you know is going to be there, especially now. I mean, is anyone going to line up to buy an Xavien Howard jersey when he might be traded? Like, right now, there are no jerseys on the team that you're buying. So I get that, but a first-round pick is still a significant enough investment that I don't think that you're necessarily thinking about 2020 with a first-round pick. So for me to really settle into, okay, we're going 3-13 this year. It's got to be not just a veteran backup quarterback, a journeyman player. Mm-hmm. Like, you're starting Trevor Siemian next year, or the equivalent of, right? Or you're bringing back David Fales to have him start, or you're taking someone like Clayton Thorson in the 3rd round from Northwestern, and he's your opening day starter. Like, name that you haven't even heard of until the start of the season, and that's going to be your guy. You're talking about the casuals that just know the quarterback. It's got to be someone that those guys don't even know. Like, that it's just going to be a complete unknown. That's how you know if a team is for real about losing this year, isn't it?
Yeah.
But do you really think that the Dolphins would go that far when they're going to have to sell tickets to 8 home games? Like, they're not going to London this year to get that cheap home game.
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, if it's Luke Falk starting a quarterback, I don't know. I mean, we always talk a lot about, what are your other options in South Florida? And there are a lot of them. None of them involve the other teams right now.
Yeah.
But I suppose that, if they do that, then yeah, the Dolphin fans are going to be sort of okay. We know what this is. Do you think the hardcores might even get excited about that? Holy crap, we're going to do this. Yeah, but how much are the? See, that's the thing. I think again, you and I are overestimating how many hardcores there are. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've said again, since building out the 5 Reasons Sports Twitter account, like. I thought my max would be 10,000. There are 10,000, and that's just social media. But
yeah.
But here's the thing: if you're really into the Dolphins and you're under 45, you're probably on.
But there's also a lot of people who are over 45 that listen to QAM all day.
Well, they do, and so they're gonna look. Here's what they're gonna do: they're gonna say publicly, fans, yeah, we need to do this. This is great. We're gonna get the first pick of the draft, and then when bleep starts to happen
when you're 0-5,
they're going to call, and this is something we need to touch on, they're going to start calling Chris Greer and Brian Flores and Reggie McKenzie idiots because the team is horrible. Look, some of it is setting expectations. The expectations, I always go back to the 2007 season with Cameron because the expectation was not to be 1-15. They drafted Ted Ginn.
That was an old team.
It was an old team, but they also drafted Ted Ginn because they thought one of the reasons they gave was that they thought that they were close to the playoffs, so they thought having a kick returner who could change field position for them. This was the reasoning, and it was we were like, but it wasn't that crazy at the time. They weren't. I mean, if you look at Saban's last two teams, his first team finished by winning 6 straight at the end of the season, was 9-7. And then the second team was disappointing 6-10, but there wasn't a feeling that the team was awful. Okay, so you went into that season thinking the team was going to be a little better, and they kind of sold John Cameron as this offensive genius. And when they weren't, then there was a lot of anger. Maybe there'll be less this time if the fans are kind of prepared for it, but it's not that much less, okay? They will still be bitching about how did the organization not find a quarterback better to fill in this year than Luke Falk or, as you say, a Trevor Siemian or whatever. Is David Fail-Stevens still on the roster? He was a Gase guy. So
I think he still is.
But he may not be there at the end of camp. But yeah, I think that, again, tanking sounds good until you go in it.
Exactly, right, which is what I've said a million times from a basketball standpoint. And I just wonder, what happens when they start losing game after game. And in some ways, is getting the narrative out via Adam Schefter your way of preparing your fans for what's eventually going to happen and having us talk about it in this kind of capacity.
Get back to our episode. I want to introduce you to another great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and that is Berlitz Broward. This is the best place to learn a language in South Florida. I can speak to it personally. My daughter, already fluent in English and Spanish, we decided to introduce her to Mandarin. She's not even 5 years old, and she's already out speaking Mandarin, knows all of the numbers up to 100, and she loves it. She loves to go back because the way that they work with her, the way that they teach her, and they also work with me as a parent with her schedule to make sure that it fits in with everything else she's doing. You can also learn languages as an adult. They teach many different languages there. Again, English, Spanish, Mandarin, Italian, German, right across the board. They teach virtually every language that you can possibly name. Here's the number that you call, 954-743-0077. That's 954-743-0077. Mention that 5 Reasons sent you. They'll take care of you. Never too early to learn a new language.
All right, so here's the next thing, right? So we hit quarterback, and there are levels, right? There's the, well, we're going to try, and then there's the, oh, no, we're not trying, and we're going to start a no-name at quarterback. My next thing is that I think bygone Dolphins eras, I was talking to Omar about this yesterday, and he was correct in describing Stephen Ross and the ownership as playing fantasy football, chasing the cotton candy in free agency. So my next question is, would a bygone era have gone after Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, signed them, and in some ways, I almost wouldn't begrudge them for it if they decided maybe we'll bring back Ryan Tannehill, maybe we'll bring in one of these veteran quarterbacks, we'll be the one that trades for Joe Flacco, we'll bring in Joe Flacco with Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, bring the AFC North from 2012 down here, and try and go again, and try and win games, and as much as, we've got on them for Ndamukong Suh, being the best player at his position that you bring in, or Mike Wallace being the best at deep threats, you are bringing probably one of the 5 best receivers and one of the 3 best running backs in football into your team. Why wouldn't the Dolphins, why do you think Stephen Ross has said, I'm done with this?
Well, yeah, I think the difference, like you said, this year from some of the previous stuff they've done is that the 2 guys that the Steelers will be walking away from, or will be walking away from them, are still elite. I don't think there's any question if Le'Veon Bell plays next season, he's elite. I mean, people forget, but he was probably the best back in football. Antonio Brown, from a route running standpoint and a playmaking standpoint, is top 5 in the NFL. And I don't think it's as much of a Roethlisberger effect as some of the other guys because Ben's not quite what he was. I think to a certain degree, Antonio Brown has propped up Ben past couple years. I know, Juju Schuster's, has been really productive for them too. But, I think they would have gone after them. Absolutely. I think they would have, because they want to make a splash. Ross has been about the splash. They haven't made any splashes of any significance over the past few years, other than Sue, which was, again, knowing football, it was kind of a foolhardy decision to give him that money. Not that he can't play, but just to give a player at that position that money. So I absolutely think they would have been in for one or both.
But do you think it would have been a bad strategy?
No, I don't know. Well, look,
I don't know if I would have minded it.
Yes, it would have been a bad strategy because the Tannehill thing had to end. So if you couldn't now, could you have again sort of put some icing on a leftover cake, okay, with Brown and Bell, and try to make people believe in Ryan Tannehill, and okay, we're going to give Ryan maybe, but to me last year kind of killed it. I mean he wasn't healthy. I understand that. I gave him respect for coming back and playing when probably he shouldn't have been playing there at the end of the season. But he regressed to such a degree. I mean, you can't even make the case with Ryan Tannehill anymore that he's all he's ever going to be, which was really what the case against him was. The case now is he even going to get back to where he was? That's a different argument. Yep. And the upside there is not great enough that it's worth it. It's different than like New Orleans signing Drew Brees after a shoulder surgery and saying, oh, can he get back to the level he was in San Diego? As it turned out, he exceeded that level
by a lot,
far and away. But you at least you knew what that San Diego Drew Brees looked like, and San Diego Drew Brees was better than Miami Ryan Tannehill. I don't know that you could have done that. When you're not bringing back Tannehill and you're going with a Luke Falk or a rookie or somebody like that, then Antonio Brown serves you no purpose. Le'Veon Bell serves you no purpose. And what I've said, too, is, again, get back to this. It's not just if you're a fan who says they're comfortable embracing a tank or a rebuild or a reset or, prime yourself for the top possible pick. Just as I say, you can't then sort of get upset at everything that happens minute to minute. You also can't jump at every squirrel that comes free. And this is a test because these are two of the top 30 players in the NFL. Not just, that they're two of the top 30 players.
You can make a reasonable argument that they'd want to be here. Antonio Brown is based in Miami. Yep. He grew up down here. Le'Veon Bell, it's been reported that he wouldn't mind playing here. Like, it's reasonable that they could get them. And if this is maybe 2006,
right,
and the reasonable facsimile of those players were available, we'd be probably doing a radio show, maybe not a podcast, but we'd be talking about how the Dolphins should go and sign those players.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, why aren't we? Other than accepting their logic that they're not going to.
Yeah, I think we're not, because I think first we've seen it not work. Second, because I don't know who the quarterback would be that would make it worth it. I think, again, if you're talking about you could go get these two guys and also get a quarterback, and you've remade your entire offense, and you've got two guys who've played together also, so that at least there'd be some alignment there, then I think if you knew you had a quarterback, I'd be fine with going after one. Okay, if you knew you had a quarterback who could play with Antonio Brown, but what is the best quarterback out there, and what is that quarterback worth? And again, if it's Nick Foles, is Nick Foles to Antonio Brown going to make you, a good enough?
And
in the
Nick
AFC?
Foles is going to cost you a lot of money,
and will cost you a ton of money, and so is that really worth it? I mean, Teddy Bridgewater, maybe. I mean, maybe he's, but there's been revisionist history. I like Teddy Bridgewater personally. I like his story. He's another Miami guy. It'd be a great story. But I mean, there's been revisionist history about Teddy's, stats. Like
even in Minnesota, yeah,
they were not good.
No.
Like they were not. I mean, he didn't take chances down the field. His touchdown numbers are anemic. I mean, you can make a pretty good argument that Tannehill was more effective than him, and so Teddy coming here, other than it being at home, and sometimes we know it's not great playing at home. And so the reason I haven't brought up, I'm against it, is not so much that Ross has sold us on a strategy. It's that I don't know what the Dolphins could do if they decided to push forward instead of backwards to make that worth it.
Right.
They're not a player away.
Are you bringing those two guys in and winning the Super Bowl? Probably not.
You need, what was always said to me when you talk to general managers, executives, is that you basically need like 8 to 10 blue chip players. Okay? You need 8 to 10 blue chip players. So getting one, if we're going to say that Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown,
how many do the Dolphins have now?
Let's say this: Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown would be their two best players.
Sure.
Okay.
Instantaneously.
Okay. So the only, to be honest, blue chip player in his prime, they have one.
I'm willing to entertain that Tunsil is not far away.
Okay, he's the closest, I would say. Okay, so you have two, and they're both at premium positions.
Sure.
Those are two of the four premium positions, cornerback and left tackle. Obviously, quarterback and pass rusher are the others, and when you whiff on a first-rounder like Charles Harris and you stay with Ryan Tannehill for 7 years, you don't have those players. But that's it. Now, let's go back to the Dolphins teams that were just missing a quarterback. Again, all due respect to Jay, okay? But go back to the Dolphins teams of sort of the late 90s, early 2000s. Jason Taylor was a blue-chip player. Zach Thomas was a blue-chip player. Patrick Surtain was a blue-chip player. Sam Madison was a blue-chip player. Tim Bowens was pretty damn close to a blue-chip player. For a couple of years, our friend Chris Chambers was he was a Pro Bowler. That's a blue-chip player. I mean, so you're talking about 5. Randy McMichael was not that far off from they haven't had a tight end like him since.
Ricky Williams was
That's
part of
6.
those teams.
Ricky Williams was a blue-chip player. We're at 7 already. Okay, they also brought in some players. Brock Marion wasn't blue-chip, but he was pretty damn good. Okay, so you and there were times that Darryl Gardner played like one. Not all the time, but there were times that he played like one. So you're already at 8 or 9 blue-chip players. Okay, and you had a top 5 defense, okay, and because really the only one we named on offense are Ricky and for a shorter period of time, Chris. If you don't, and Mark Dixon, I think, played a couple of years like a blue chip player. This team doesn't have. I mean, it's Xavien Howard, okay. Rashad Jones is not that anymore. He was. Cameron Wake was. He's not quite that anymore. Tunsil. Okay, so the rest of the roster. Can Jerome Baker be one in a couple of years? He showed some signs this year. There's some promise there. Minka Fitzpatrick, I think, is on course to be a blue chip player. But even best case scenario, we're in my house right now, so that's why you hear the landscape. But even best case scenario, you're talking 4, 5. It's not enough.
Yeah.
It's not enough.
So because part of tanking is not just finding the number 1 overall pick at quarterback. It's building up a bevy of draft arsenal so that you can start to find some of those players and give yourself as many chances as possible to basically do what the Browns have done, which is, I mean, going into this year, the Browns, if you look at their roster, you could have made an argument that's a playoff caliber team, and in some respects, that bore out because the moment that Baker Mayfield started playing and Hugh Jackson got fired, they were a playoff team.
Right.
They have built up a roster, and they're going to have another opportunity in this draft to continue to build up that roster as sort of that playoff step, but I think you're right in saying the Dolphins are far enough away that unless they have a superstar quarterback, even with a solid quarterback, they might not have enough at roster talent, and thus signing Bell and Brown wouldn't be worth it.
There's only one blue chip player in the entire market right now. There's all of sports down here. And that's Barkov.
Yeah, I think even he at times.
Drifts.
He could do more, yeah. I
mean, he's got 22 goals, right? I mean, Barkov should have 35 goals at this point.
Yeah, he should be in the upper echelon of maybe not necessarily in the goals chart, but definitely in the points chart.
Right. I mean, when someone can do what he did the other night on the breakaway.
Ridiculous.
Okay.
Ridiculous.
But he is the only person in this town, I think, and I think Howard got close this year, who you're like, he can do something today that you haven't seen before. That doesn't. I mean, certainly the Heat don't have that guy, and the Marlins are light years away from that person. I mean, you and I are going to go up to tape some podcasts next week up at spring training. We're probably going to talk to Monte Harrison, who seems to be, of everybody, the one with the upside that says maybe he can be that. But look, you go a few years ago. I mean, Stanton was a blue chip player in his sport. Yelich just was the MVP, so he was rising to a blue chip player.
Is definitely a blue chip catcher.
Right. Ozuna was a blue chip player, okay, or at least for that 2-year period. And obviously the Heat have had their share.
And Jose was too.
Jose was too, okay? I mean, and right now this market is totally barren of those. And so I just you can't be thinking championship. You can't be thinking Antonio Brown. You can't be thinking Le'Veon Bell. You're just thinking, okay, can we grow? Can we get enough assets to grow this thing out? And just to take it back a little bit as far as, when you go for the one player or when you don't. The biggest, I've said this before on a podcast, but I covered Jimmy Johnson's years here. And where Jimmy went wrong was 1998 and 1999. I thought Jimmy's strategy initially here was brilliant. He came in and he had like 15 draft picks his first year. He kept trading down and trading down and trading down. Take a look at that 1996 draft. It's fascinating, okay? He kind of missed on the first-round pick, Darryl Gardner. He was right about ability, but not about his head, okay? It was a large head, but it was, but just as far as being committed all the time. And OJ McDuffie in our network tells a great story about almost pulling a gun on Darryl because that's who Darryl was. So thankfully OJ was talked out of that. Yeah. But look, I think that if you look at that 96 draft, he kept trading down, accumulating picks, and so what happens? Takes a flyer on a linebacker, an undersized, middle linebacker from Texas Tech in the 5th round.
Defensive end from Akron.
A defensive end from Akron, and the one guy on the Hall of Fame and one guy who should be. And so he just kept accumulating these picks. And then you look he did in 97. Okay, that was Jason Taylor, Derek Rogers, third round. He did very well in that draft too. Okay, Sam Madison. Okay, in the second round. 98, he trades up. He trades a future first rounder to get Surtain, but made a bunch of other mistakes in that draft. And then 99 was the year that killed him, because there was a year. It was the Randy Moss thing. It was the year to go get that player. The foundation had been built. He built this defense, which was every bit the equal of the defense that he had in Dallas. He needed one offensive playmaker, one, okay? Give Dan – Dan was not mobile at that stage. Dan was not what Dan was, okay, and everything. But give him one and give it a go for that 1 year. And instead, he didn't take Randy Moss. He ends up making a trade for John Avery, okay, and, trades down, and, the rest is sort of history. There is a point with every organization where you make the decision, okay, now we go for it. Atlanta, a few years ago, perfect example, right? We're trading our whole damn draft to get Julio Jones. Mm-hmm. Whatever it takes, okay? We have our quarterback. We've got our quarterback. Roddy White is aging. We need another guy who's going to be elite, and you go make that move. And look, they haven't won a Super Bowl, but they got to a Super Bowl.
And Los Angeles just did that, going for Cooks, going for Sue, going for everyone. It's like, we've got Jared Goff. He's in the third year of his rookie deal. It's going to get expensive soon. Let's go, and let's go now.
Right, but the Dolphins are 2 years away from that.
Yeah.
There is no one player who's going to change the fortunes of this franchise unless it's the quarterback. And you're not getting that quarterback this offseason unless you get lucky and a Kyler Murray falls to you and he is that quarterback. But there is no one else I can see this year in free agency, anywhere else, that would be that. And so that's why I keep saying the same thing. It's great that Steve Ross has picked a strategy. I think the strategy was chosen for him.
Sure.
You're looking at this roster and you're like, who's elite on this roster? How close are we?
I don't think normal NFL executives would choose this under any circumstances. If you think about, the Browns had to bring in, Paul DePodesta from baseball and Sashi Brown from outside of football in order to really do this. And it had to have come from an idea from ownership. I mean, and we have kind of seen in ensuing stories that ownership a little bit crazy. But I do sort of wonder. Obviously, Stephen Ross, having decided this, how much farther they're going to go with it.
Hey, it's Seth Levitt here from the Fish Tank with my main man,
O.J. McDuffie, the Juice.
And Juice, we've got a special guest over the next 2 weeks in the tank.
What's up, everybody? It's Pat Surtain, and I'm officially diving into the Fish Tank. If he was better than Peyton, he definitely wasn't better than me.
Oh, there we go.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah, that's where we're going with it.
Did you and Peyton ever play against each other in high school?
Absolutely. Beat him 35-7.
35 to
Get out of
7.
here.
Oh, yeah. I had 3 rushing and 2 passing on him, accounted for all 5 touchdowns.
Had hands in all of them.
Yeah.
Hey, Pat came in here saying he doesn't remember stuff, but he remembered
I remember
all of
that.
Make sure you dive into the tank to hear our entire interview with Patrick Surtain here on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. You can catch up on what you've missed and hear new episodes every 2 weeks until July by searching The Fish Tank on Apple Music, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, or wherever else you find your favorite podcasts.
Another question to ask, you mentioned the free agency decision. You mentioned the Xavien Howard and Laremy Tunsil thing. And that, for me, is interesting because those guys help you win games. Yes. They're good players. But if you're doing a rebuild, like you said, the 4 things you're looking for are quarterback, left tackle, pass rushing defensive end, and shutdown corner. You've got 2 of those 4 things. That's why Alfredo from 3 yards per carry is confused about a rebuild or a tank, because you have those things. And so why are you going to tear this apart when all you need to do is find those next 2 things in order to really fill out your team? So would you extend Xavien Howard and Laremy Tunsil in the circumstance you're heading into next year with? And if not, are you trading them, but realistically, the hope is that you find a player, that left tackle, that's as good as Laremy Tunsil, and a player at corner that's as good as Xavien Howard?
I would extend both.
Yeah,
I would extend both. Because it's an age thing too. I mean, you're talking about guys who are in their early to mid 20s. Like, if you're, it comes back to this: if you're not extending them, if you're not taking care of them, who are you taking care of? That's a different conversation than going out and getting Antonio Brown, who's entering what should start to be a downslope of his career, or Le'Veon Bell, who plays a position where even after taking this last year off, he's only.
You look at his touch total the year before; it's madness.
Well, I mean, he's got a Ricky Williams touch total. Like, so in 2 years, what is he going to look like? And he's also at a position that, we know is somewhat interchangeable. He's better than a lot of other guys. I'm not going to argue otherwise. He's better, but I just don't think that you make that kind of commitment. And then they haven't been in your program.
So, Antonio Brown's 30.
Right. So, I mean, so what are we looking at? Another 2 years at this level? I mean, how many? I mean, Steve Smith, there's been some guys who've played pretty well into their mid-30s.
Bolden.
Yeah, but Anquan was a different kind of receiver than Antonio Brown, too. I mean, Anquan Bolden was just, I mean, he would rip the ball out of your hands on a 12-yard, in cut. Like, that's different than what you're expecting Antonio Brown to do, who is the best route runner in the game, has been for a long time. But also, can take you deep, can do a lot of other things. How is that skill set going to look in 2 years? To me, you have to reward your own. There's another thing here, too. If you're building your program and you're basically Laremy Tunsil and Xavien Howard get to the point where they're the two best players on your team, and the first thing you're looking to do is dump them for draft picks, that's not a great message to send internally with anybody else. And so, and to be in a situation where Brian Flores is trying to establish himself in a locker room, and other guys are looking at him, and maybe he's not making the decision because it's Greer, but he knows that he's buddies with Greer, okay, and they're putting this thing together, and the other guys in the locker room are looking at Brian Flores like, okay, so what happens? I'm going to get really good and you're going to trade me? That's not a great. That's the NFL, but it's not a great place to start as an organization.
And to me, I think that individual players can be really good, but also not impact winning to such a degree. I will say, though, I'm a bit more concerned about Xavien Howard than I am about Tunsil, because you can put 4 bad offensive linemen next to him. Your offensive line is probably going to be bad, or at the very least, you're not going to attack him. And maybe you can say the same about corner, where you're not going to attack that one corner. But I also think that if you're really dead set on getting Tua, you probably got to go 2-14. And could Xavien Howard get?
But you can do that though. Xavien Howard was held out of games last year where he probably could have played.
And I think they'd probably do the same. But for me, it's more about you're gonna have games that, even as bad as you're going to be, they're going to be one-score games, and there's going to be 2 or 3 plays to be made. And could Xavien Howard make those plays? And the answer is yes.
Yes, but you can't. See, that's where I think you and I differ. I don't think you can operate in fear of winning. I understand you're committing to a tank, but to me, this is, look, you can commit to a tank, but if you win games, it's not like that's a terrible result anyway, because if you're building a culture,
if you win too many, it is. But if you win 4, then that's not the worst thing.
Right, and you still, look, any team can move up from 5 to 1 or 2 if they give up enough assets.
Well, no, I disagree with that. If you're specifically targeting Tua, if you're a bad team next year that gets the number 1 overall pick, that team is not giving it up under any circumstances.
Right, but is this what we're doing? Is this where we're at? I feel like the Tua thing to me, like, is I know it's an interlocking conversation with the tanking and being bad, but I think there's too much emphasis on this. It's sort of like the luck thing. Like, okay, like Trevor Lawrence is going to be available in a couple of years, right? There's always another.
Sure.
Okay? There's always another. And sometimes the another is a guy you didn't expect. Aaron Rodgers was right there for the Dolphins.
Yeah.
Okay? Could have taken him.
Yeah.
Okay? Drew Brees was right there for a lot of teams. Like, I mean, Mahomes was there for, 9? What was he go, 10th?
He's theoretically available at every team because the team from 29 traded up to go get him.
Correct. So what I'm saying is, this idea that it's there are 2 different things here. There's resetting your organization, which is what I think Ross is really doing. Resetting your organization to try to be more nimble, okay, get rid of dead weight, not try to patch things, all right, try to build a core of young players, and hopefully, along the way, if you're high up in the draft, you identify the right quarterback and you get that quarterback. That's one thing. Then there's another thing that we're basically going all in for one player. Mm-hmm. If they're trying to do that, they're probably going to fail at that anyway. Yeah, somebody's going to be worse than them by accident.
It's too hard. For me, the point that I wanted to make in this podcast was it's too hard to be that bad.
Right.
Like, it's really hard in the NFL to go 2-14.
So if you're going to try to, I mean, look at how incompetent the Dolphins have been over the years and how few times they've quote unquote accomplished
that.
I
mean, we tagged them with mediocre. You're still winning 8 times in being mediocre.
Right. I mean, they've had the 1-15. They had a 4-12. Wannstedt's last season.
Yeah. Cut the number of wins from the mediocre Dolphins in half, and you have what you need. And that might need to get 1. That might not even be enough.
But then you can't make a decision. We're not going to play. We're going to trade Xavien Howard because he might be able to show competence. If he does, he does. Like I just don't. If he does, and he and Minkah Fitzpatrick are developing into an elite secondary, at least half of an elite secondary. So what's the worst? So why is that so bad? I mean, unless you luck into 7-9 again, which I don't think this team is going to be capable of doing. Look, Xavien Howard can steal a game or two, but Luke Falk's going to cost you 6. Okay? I
played ping pong against Luke Falk, and even with a broken hand, he destroyed me. So I'm not doubting his athletic ability.
Well, you were tanking at ping pong. I lost in the quarterfinals to Kenny Stills. I don't think you can operate in a scared way to go get one player. And that does drive me a little crazy about that sector of Dolphin fans, which sometimes you sort of gravitate towards, is that this idea that you can engineer the whole thing as if there are other teams that aren't trying to engineer the exact same thing.
I don't think there are. I don't think I think in basketball there are. I think in basketball there's a lot of teams on this corner. I don't think in football there is. And I'm not saying you engineer it, but to me it's if you're going to do it, then do it. Like, if you're going to do it...
But then hold out... Look, Xavien Howard can pull a hamstring in Week 9. I mean, last year he came back, I was surprised, because, I don't know what that was.
It was like an MCL, wasn't it?
Yeah, and who knows what kind of procedure he had done. I just don't think... on the overall, I don't think you can sort of... I don't think you can engineer it completely. It's too difficult to do that. And it's not about one player. I mean, look, it's crazy. Like, and I think Tua is going to be terrific. But I watched the national championship game. He wasn't the best quarterback on the field. So we're talking not for that night, okay? Maybe he will be long term. But are we saying like everything is about getting to? I mean, even Andrew Luck, who has been a good NFL quarterback, hasn't led the Colts anywhere. Got hurt. Didn't even know if he was going to come back. Would I take him? Yes. Is he top 10? I think he's top 10. Is he top 5? No. He's not. Colin Cowherd can drool over him as much as he wants, but I'm sorry. At this stage, Rodgers is better. Breeze is still better. Brady is still better in terms of what you need from a quarterback. Mahomes is now better. Russell Wilson is better. Same draft. So we're talking about you're going to engineer everything, suck for luck, because it was a catchy slogan, tank for Tua, that we're going to engineer everything for one particular player. Russell Wilson was there for you. Nobody wanted him. He went 3rd round. I don't think they can get in this trap of saying we have to be first next year or the whole thing is worthless. No, if they end up with the 5th pick in the draft, okay, maybe there's a quarterback there. Maybe there isn't. Maybe they trade that pick to someone else for a future first, so they get in the Lawrence sweepstakes, after that. There's all kinds of different options for them. I think we've sort of overplayed that. And I also think, and I do want to touch on this before we close, I also think what they've done with the rest of the front office indicates to me that they're not really full tank. I don't know why Reggie McKenzie, and Reggie McKenzie had a checkered history with Oakland. We were looking at it before the podcast. 2014 draft, obviously, Derek Carr, Khalil Mack, that's pretty damn good. Okay? Although Mack's gone now, but McKenzie didn't have a lot to say once Gruden got there. McKenzie's track record in Green Bay
he drafted the best defensive player in football. That's pretty damn good.
Pretty good. Green Bay, he had some role there, but Ted Thompson had a big hand in it. There are others.
Sure.
Wolf's son that had a big role. Elliott Wolf had a big role, and everything was going on there. But the rest of McKenzie's draft record, according to, I'm just reading stories from Oakland, they were not happy with him at all.
There's a sense, and I was talking to Omar about this, he's better at pro personnel than college personnel, and apparently the guy they brought in from Buffalo is the opposite.
Okay.
And that he's more the college guy.
Well, and I like this. I like the experience. I mean, I hadn't mentioned Reggie McKenzie as a possible GM candidate before they gave it to Greer, but it's hard for me to believe that Chris Greer is sitting in a meeting with Reggie McKenzie, who has worked for a championship-level organization in Green Bay, who has run his own show in Oakland.
Who just hired a bunch of people from New England.
Right. And you're saying to Reggie McKenzie, okay, or the guy you brought in from Buffalo or anybody else, we're going to try to get Tua next year, and that's all that's on the agenda. That's it. We're going to be as bad as we can. You're basically telling people to come in here and find the worst possible quarterback you can. That's not happening. That's not happening. They're basically the whole idea is to accumulate as many young assets as they possibly can, so that they can.
So you think this is actually more of a rebuild than like?
Yes.
Because I think like the Philly way is like radiation. Right, where
you're talking about the Sixers.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Philadelphia 76ers way is that like it's chemotherapy is what it is. So you don't think they're going that far? You don't think that the Dolphins are going through chemotherapy right now? They're going through treatment.
Treatment, right? I don't think that Steve Ross can stomach chemotherapy. And we've talked about this. I mean, I don't think that he can stomach what that stadium is going to look like if they throw out the worst possible players they can every week. If they're bad by accident, okay, which is probably going to be the case, it is what it is. But if there's a sense that he's trying to lose, because you know how fans who are, again, the fans who are not that sort of tugged into this, they don't know about the whole idea of getting up to get this pick or that pick. They're just going to think he's cheap.
Right.
Which he's not.
Which he's not, yeah.
Like of all the complaints about him, the one complaint that has never made any sense is that he won't spend money. He will spend money, but if they're throwing out there guys who, are not, should not even be backup quarterbacks in the league and they're starting for this team, it's just going to be perceived that he's cheap. And that's going to happen anyway. During free agency, all these guys are going to go. Dolphins aren't doing anything. Heat fans. Heat fans are educated about the cap, right? Because they had to live it. They learned it. Okay, the LeBron thing and all that. Most Heat fans, but not all Heat fans. But even so, after the trade deadline, the Heat didn't do anything. The Heat didn't do anything. Because once it actually happens, it's different.
Well, Mickey Harrison was actually being cheap.
Well, he was, although in this case I understand
It's
why.
justifiable cheapness, but it's still cheapness.
Well, right. But basically pretending you're going for the playoffs and sitting Kelly Olynyk to save his minutes. We all agreed on this. I don't want to deviate too much into Heat, but Nekias, you should check out our Heat pod, which is actually still very relevant before the Heat start the second half. But Nekias and Duncan and Greg Sylvander and I did a pod this week, the 5 things we'd like to see from the Heat, and one of them was if you're actually trying to make the playoffs, Kelly Olynyk should be playing. And he wasn't playing, and I think what happened was they held him out long enough that they sort of calculated his number and are like, okay, now we can make him a starter because if he plays 25 minutes a night, he's not going to kick in that incentive, okay, that forces us to pay him more and go over the tax. That's cheap, okay? Understandable again, but cheap. Ross has not been cheap, and so, but it is going to be perceived that way when you're playing quarterbacks who are making, backup safety money.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, if you're going to have, Matt Ryan making what he's making, okay, and then Garoppolo making that kind of money, and you're going to have a guy making $1 million to play quarterback for you. I mean, look, Jay Cutler was a $10 million project a couple of years ago. I just think
Josh McCown was $10 million last year for the Jets.
And I don't think the Dolphins quarterback's going to be making that much.
No.
So it is going to be perceived as cheap, even if it's smart. And what I would like to see them do is take a couple quarterbacks late in the draft. If this is the direction you're going, that you've decided you're not going to go get a Foles, you're not going to go get a Carr, even a Bridgewater, take a couple quarterbacks late in the draft.
See if there's Russell Wilson out there.
Let them compete. Right.
Yep.
And we've seen this before. There's a lot of examples of this. You mentioned Trevor Xavien before, and it's a bit of a punchline. But the reality is Trevor Xavien was
terrible.
But he was also the second quarterback the Broncos drafted that year. They drafted Paxton Lynch the same year, higher. Simeon beat him out. You go back.
Started opening night.
Yeah, there's a good example of this. Washington, several years ago. Now Heath Schuler is a congressman, or I think he's still in politics. But Heath Schuler was a first-round pick, was a premium draft pick. They took a flyer on Gus Frerotte in the 7th round. Gus Frerotte beat out Heath Schuler, was never an elite NFL quarterback, had a pretty good year here with Miami, but he was a competent NFL quarterback who had a decent career. You can find those guys in the 5th through 7th round. The Dolphins have never, with the exception of, what was the one guy that just went through here? Oh, Dowdy.
Yeah.
They've never really done that.
Yeah.
So if you're,
think about like what the Patriots got for Jacoby Brissett, who was a 6th-round pick.
Well, the Dolphins are in play for potentially. There's some reports for Jacoby Brissett. So why not take a flyer on a guy with high upside, somewhere between 5? Now maybe Luke Falk's that guy. He was. I mean, the Titans didn't think so, but maybe Luke Falk's that guy. If you're going to go that way, bring in 2 other guys like that. All right. I don't want to hear about, we couldn't take the special teams linebacker in the 6th round. Take the special teams linebacker as an undrafted free agent, okay?
Yeah.
Stop investing draft picks in positions that don't mean anything.
Or positions that that have very little significance or added value. Like, take big swings in the draft.
Well, you know what's going to happen now? All these teams are going to take traditional fullbacks because the Patriots, ran that eye stuff, okay, and everything else with the traditional, your traditional, 250-pound roided-up white fullback.
All that is old is new again.
Right. So you're going to see them do that.
But where in college football they're fullbacks?
I have no idea. I have no idea.
There might be like offensive tackles at like D3 schools that aren't big enough.
That's basically what you would go for. But I don't want to see the Dolphins burn draft picks on positions that don't matter.
Yeah.
I would
Take swings, man.
I would rather have them take a quarterback who grades at, say, a 62 out of 100 than to take a linebacker who grades at 72 on special teams. You have to – value in the NFL is equated to position.
Yep.
And that is – and we've mentioned them again and again. Quarterback, left tackle, defensive end, and corner. Okay? Those are the 4 positions. You have 2 of the 4. Take as many swings as you can at quarterback and defensive end. Just keep taking swings, okay? And once you have that, then the rest of the team will fill in, all right? The rest of the team will fill in. But you don't need to keep sort of going out that way. So if they take 2 quarterbacks in the draft, let them compete. You know what? That would give the fans would watch that at training camp.
It would make preseason games interesting.
Right. Who's better? Right. Preseason games would probably be more interesting than the games.
Right, exactly,
that third preseason game. So,
or even if they go into the year just playing dual quarterbacoorbacks. We're just going to swap them in and out.
Yeah,
what if one of them is just like a crazy running quarterback and he's like a wildcat guy? Like, if you're going to lose, you might as well make it fun. All right.
Nothing could be less interesting than Ryan Tannehill.
That is for damn sure. All right, so that is our prescription for Dolphins tanking and how it is going to look like. I think this is a fascinating conversation. Obviously, we'll continue to have as we move towards the draft. Coming up later in the week, we'll hear from Michael Lee of The Athletic on the NBA. As you mentioned, check out our podcast from earlier this week on the Miami Heat with Nekias Duncan and Leif from Miami Heat Beat. Thanks for subscribing to the podcast, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the 5 Reasons Podcast. Thank you so much.